In the name of our all-compassionate God, triune yet one. Amen. Simply to remind us where we've been coming from, we began last week in this month of compassion, August, the month of compassion, with a sermon series around love. Last week we looked at something of the differentiation between agape love and eros love, recognizing that eros love is quite selective in that it's activated by a stimulation of our feelings towards people, and then that will hopefully lead to loving thoughts and loving deeds. Agape love, all-inclusive, indiscriminate, starts with choosing to think loving thoughts because everyone is created by God. And those loving thoughts will lead hopefully to loving deeds, and they may or may not. There's no requirement that we then have loving feelings. We also had a fresh look at Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 and 23, which was the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, forgiveness, and so on. And we recognized that originally that passage had no punctuation, and that theologians are beginning to say that in fact the punctuation isn't love, comma, joy, comma, so that you have 9 fruits of the Spirit, but that we have one fruit of the Spirit, love, colon, and then joy, peace, patience are expressions of that love. When we look at agape love in that way, it's very easy to soft soap it and sentimentalize it. In fact, agape love is robust, and there's a part of it that we would perhaps even name tough love. So for this morning, we're going to look at parts of love which are 3 key dimensions or dynamics. Very suitable given that this weekend we commemorated Women's Day. 20,000 women, 1956, marching peaceably with these 3 dimensions deeply incarnate in the way in which they handled great injustice. And those dimensions are justice, truth, and grace. Whilst we may speak with those 3 dimensions quite separately in order to gain a greater understanding, when they are within the context of agape love, we need to understand that they are deeply embedded in one another. There is a sense in which their meanings overlap consistently, and unless they are integrated into the whole, we actually miss out on the dynamic they bring to agape love. In the Hebrew understanding of those 3, the justice, the love, and the grace, they are in essence relational. We very often relegate them to something separate from ourselves, but in fact, given the Hebrew mindset, they impact our understanding of how we relate to God, to ourselves, and to other, in whatever form the other may be. When we explore these a little deeper, which we are going to do in a moment, we'll start realizing, and it's not a bad thing, it just simply is, that the way in which we have looked at those 3 dynamics have been deeply affected by Roman law and a Western mindset. And it would be a blessing for us if we would just reclaim the Hebrew mindset around it. It would help us to relook at our image of God, because our image of God has been deeply influenced also by our Western mindset. So let's start looking at the gift that these bring in the richness of how the love is impacted in the dynamism of paradigm that we live in. Let's begin with justice. Now, very often, and given our context as well in South Africa, When we hear the word justice, we default to legal systems, to jurisprudence, and those sorts of things. If we've had any sense of a British or a Germanic imprint on us, maybe the image we carry, the picture, is of a rather po-faced judge who adheres strictly to the law and is completely unaffected by the person who is being put forward to be judged. Unaffected, very neutral. So when we have that kind of image, we can understand how that translates into how we see God whenever we hear the word God, our judge. Then we have that secondary implied association with justice around judge, is that God is looking for ways constantly to punish us, to criminalize us because of our wrongdoing. Justice in the Bible, thanks be to God, is quite different. It is, in fact, an active expression of God's compassion. Justice, then, in the Bible, is linked to God taking sides. Now, that already is, for some of us, a button pusher. Because it sounds as if, when God takes sides, that God is being unfair and that God has favorites. But again, that is not the Hebrew worldview. God's justice is that God takes sides for, not against. So God takes sides for the underprivileged, the suffering, the weak, the poor. God is not taking sides for those of us who are perhaps not feeling weak, not feeling poor. Because in a sense, God will always take our side too, because in the sense in which we are being exposed to injustice in any way, God is on our side. So there's no exclusion. It's simply a different way of understanding how God's justice works, that relational aspect. Remember earlier I said that God's justice is around compassion. What is fascinating is that in the origin of that word, which became prevalent in the times when Latin was spoken, which of course was the Roman world, compassion was never separate from Christ. It's only as we have developed over time into the English understanding of that word that we've left Christ out. So the original understanding, that compassion of Latin, was suffering together with the crucified Christ. That was the original meaning. So the implication is that wherever we find somebody who is in a place or position that calls forth our compassion, that when we are compassionate towards those who are suffering, those who are implicated in some sort of injustice, the weak, the poor, then we are fulfilling Matthew chapter 25, and we are ministering, in fact, not to the individual exclusively, but we are having compassion on the crucified Christ. It goes even one step further, this God justice, because not the requirement so much, but the automatic understanding of the biblical times would be we wouldn't only address with compassion those who are suffering injustice, including God being unjustly treated, by the way. We've also got to examine what is causing the injustice, the misery. And understandably, again, as we've seen, and we know it in our history, in the very fibre of our being, when we fulfill this divine injustice, we are going to be criticized. We are going to be seen as tough nuts and controversial. And that will be very often because we have upset the status quo. So be ready for it. Jesus experienced it, and we are Jesus' people. We come now to truth. And truth for most of us is something that is linked to honesty. A good thing, a godly thing, but not the only way of understanding truth. Given that a lot of our Gospels were written in Greek, not only Aramaic, we need to look at the Greek understanding as well as the ancient Aramaic. The Greek understanding of the word truth comes from aletheia, spelled A-L-E-T-H-E-I-A. And aletheia literally means to tear away a veil. Tear away a veil. So it's about having an unveiled reality. No disguises, no masks, no hiddenness. For some of us that may feel very harsh. That may feel quite threatening, this kind of complete exposure of who we are. You'll be glad to know that's addressed also in grace. Remember, when we are unveiled, God always looks at us with soft eyes. The Apostle John puts another interesting word with this aletheia truth. In chapter 3 of his Gospel, verse 21, he says, whoever lives by the truth comes into the light. Implication there is that the light of God shines because of the truth. And revelation happens within that. Deception disappears and God's reality becomes more visible. Now let's look at the Hebrews, the ancient Hebrews. They didn't have an objective sense of truth versus untruth. We in the West still talk about the truth as an abstract. What the Hebrews apparently understood is what is reliable in an existential sense. So let's give a good example of this in a practical way. How would we see it? And this is fascinating because it takes us into the world of ethics, moral ethics and situational ethics. Don't know if you remember the story in Exodus chapter 1 of the midwives. We have a king of Egypt, we have the Hebrew slaves. Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, has said to the midwives, I want you, each time you go and deliver baby boys of the Hebrew women, I want you to kill those babies as you deliver them, the boys, not the girls. So, they don't kill the baby boys, they make a choice. Pharaoh notices, hang on, we've had a superabundance of little Hebrew babies, what's going on here? I've told these women they've got to kill them. So he calls them. And the women say this, very diplomatic, very astute women. They say to Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. Now most of us would think, hang on, they're lying. Western mindset. Go back to that reliability, because the Hebrews see truth as your reliability in terms of your integrity in your vocation that God has called you to and the vocation that God has given to humanity. So in fact, the Hebrew women are being truthful because they are being trustworthy and faithful to enabling the birthing of new life and to protecting new life. There's a whole different slant. And that thing about the Greek, about the aletheia, the veil being drawn aside, we see this also in this episode. Because what is unveiled is the Pharaoh's fears and also the Pharaoh's political insecurities. I find this very helpful, in fact, even in our context today. Let's move on to grace. Grace now also fleshes out the unveiling, where we were feeling perhaps that exposure that everything about our lives is going to be put out there for everyone's viewing. Grace says, no, you are allowed a veil. There are certain veils when they shelter or protect or do something to help us to cope with life, that it's not appropriate to reveal certain vulnerabilities in our lives, certain shames perhaps, or painful areas that we're not ready yet to deal with. And God says grace covers that. There's a graciousness about that. We know that, and very many of us know the definition of grace being the undeserved and unearned favor of God. The Greek word for it is charis, spelled C-H-A-R-I-S. And charis is the root word for the English word charming. So grace is meant to be attractive, that presence of attractiveness, the radiance of warmth and acceptance and joy. Now, interestingly, Jesus never used that word in the entire, well, at least it wasn't recorded in any of the Gospels we have, but he lived it. Go and read John chapter 4 with the Samaritan woman at the well. So grace isn't just tolerance. It's more active than that. It's a building on relationship in that acceptance, so that when we encounter people, irrespective of their friend, foe, or stranger, that acceptance is about seeing people with the eyes of Jesus in their God-given potential and all future possibilities. Just a little aside question, given this idea, this dynamic, this relationality of grace. When last did I look at ourselves with grace? Justice, truth, and grace. Three indispensable dynamics of agape love. Quite big mind shifts in this teaching and re-understanding of those. And quite overwhelming, perhaps, as we re-look at it. So I want to leave us with something perhaps a little more simple. It comes from St. Teresa of Calcutta, and maybe we can just hang those onto this. Apparently this was a motto she gave to her co-workers. Instead of trying to always hang on to agape love, justice, truth, grace, all of those things, she just gave them this motto. Never allow yourself to meet someone who will not be happier after they encounter you. Never allow yourself to meet someone who will not be happier after they've encountered you. Amen. Amen.